This is very, very dangerous, isn't it, for Australia's foreign policy management when we have a partisan divide about a relationship as crucial as China's?
I think so, Chris. We've seen a bit of a mixed message from different political leaders. So we've seen some state leaders sounding like they don't understand that the world's changed with the global pandemic, and they haven't noticed the naked economic coercion out of the Chinese government, from Ambassador Cheng right to Beijing. So the tired old words about get the tone right, manage the relationship, have been trotted out, while other parts of the Labor Party, like Penny Wong, have understood, no, the Prime Minister is doing exactly the right thing, calling for a credible international inquiry into how this pandemic started and what we can learn to prevent future ones. Well, I think Beijing is used... sorry, go ahead, Chris.
No, sorry to interrupt, Michael. I mean, you're right. Penny Wong, of course, is Labor's foreign policy spokesperson. She has been sensible. I had Anthony Albanese on this program last night. He was sensible on these issues. But you've got state premiers, of course, saying we've got to preserve this relationship, Canberra's got to fix this, suggesting that somehow we're culpable. And either remain silent or surely argue that Australia's in the right here and that Beijing ought to tone things down.
Well, exactly. I think there's been too much debate in Australia about, is it something we said? If we say it differently, will it be better? The fault here is with Beijing and the Chinese government. A credible international inquiry is deeply damaging to the Chinese government because it will show how they repressed information about the disease, how they prevented action, and they didn't ask for international help. And then they inflicted suffering and death on their own people and on the rest of the world. That's why they don't want this inquiry. But that's exactly why the Prime Minister was right to call for it. So I think a lot of our state leaders and other parties that are calling to soothe Beijing over this are sounding very last season, because the public is way ahead of people that are trotting out those rusted old words.
Yeah, I suppose from my point of view, the most plausible criticism that's come from these people is that Australia could have done more work to work up some international consensus behind an investigation before saying anything publicly. Now, you can argue that case. It's complicated. As you know, foreign policy is always nuanced. But what troubles me with that argument is these are the same people who say that Australia should lead, be independent, be strong-minded. And this is such an unarguable position, such a really incontestably good idea, and Australia is doing that work through the G20 anyway. It would seem that Scott Morrison and Maurice Payne were absolutely right to say sensibly that there should be an international investigation.
Well, how do you start to build an international consensus? You don't do it by shutting up. You do it by speaking and making the case. The Australian government has led the world debate on 5G technology and the security implications of that. And it did it by doing the right thinking, the right analysis, and then speaking up. And I think that's exactly what's happened here with this inquiry. You build international support by speaking, not by being silent. So the EU is already putting a very favourable motion into the World Health Assembly. And I think part of the reason for that is because of Australia's leadership on this.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, if Australia tried to quietly lobby for this among G20 nations, well, the first people to find out would be China, and they'd think you're sort of doing this in a secretive way, sort of trying to build a coalition against them. Much better to conduct this discussion publicly and openly, as you suggest. Just finally, Michael, tell us about how Beijing and its foreign policy establishment, its political establishment, might try and manipulate divisions like this in Australia for its own ends.
Well, I think Beijing wants to split Australia on China policy. They would have hoped that there would have been a lot more discontent with the Prime Minister and the government on this inquiry. They would have hoped for less support out of the Labor Party, but they'd be delighted at the statements from state leadership and things like Victoria's Treasurer saying doubling down on the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative will help Victoria out of the economic problems from the pandemic. No one in their right mind wants to give more leverage to Beijing in the recovery from the pandemic. So I think Beijing will have been a little bit confronted by the new voices speaking up against deeper entanglement with the Chinese economy.
Just quickly on that, the AWU, how important is that to have such a leading union, a right-wing union, speaking up on behalf of the coalition government?
Well, it reminds me a bit of the Howard years with the aspirational voters voting so strongly for John Howard. So it's a real political opportunity to join up with new constituencies that are saying we've got to reduce the leverage that the Chinese regime has over Australia's economic future. And I think the pandemic strangely gives us that opportunity. We've got products and food and agriculture that are valued even more in these uncertain times.